All right, and hello there, United States history students. This is the first of two recorded lectures on the United States Constitution for our Foundational Documents unit. The Constitution is the foundational law of the land. All other laws in the United States are based upon the laws of the Constitution. It is a complicated document with a rich history. There's a lot to say about the United States Constitution. However, for the purposes of our class, I'm going to be focusing on two big ideas related to the Constitution in terms of what it does to help create our democracy. The first thing I'm going to talk about, which I'm going to discuss in this recorded slideshow lecture, is the separation of powers. And then in the second lecture, I'm going to discuss the individual rights that we are granted in the United States Constitution. All right, so that's it. This is United States History at Upper Arlington High School. I'm your teacher, Mr. Endress. Let's begin. So you guys remember that the United States Constitution was not the first law of the land. When our country was created in the 1770s and 1780s, when we broke free from Great Britain, we had the first law of the land, which was the Articles of Confederation. You should remember that our goal at this point in time, and this makes sense, was to not be Great Britain. So Great Britain had a parliament and a king, and they were tyrannical with their power in terms of how they treated us here in the American colonies. And we wanted to create a new form of government that, go figure, would be the opposite of that. So we wanted a form of government with a very, very, very weak federal government and very powerful and strong state governments. And that's what the original United States of America was like. You really were a citizen of the state first, and the state was pretty much your country. But then the state was united with the rest of the United States. There was a common postal service, there was an army, but the federal government did not have the ability to tax its citizens. It had to rely upon states to contribute money to the federal government. There was no way for the federal government to govern interstate commerce between the states. That caused a lot of problems. And it was nearly impossible, or at least very difficult, for the federal government under the Articles of Confederation to pass a law. To amend the Articles of Confederation, there needed to be unanimous approval by all of the 13 states. And that was very difficult to do. So almost immediately, problems arose under the Articles of Confederation. My favorite example of a problem that arose was when Connecticut and New Jersey teamed up to almost declare war. They did threaten to declare war against the state of New York because of the high tariffs that New York was placing on any ships that were coming in to New York Harbor to deliver goods to another state, and New Jersey and Connecticut right next door to New York. And so New Jersey and Connecticut almost declared war on New York. That's not good, civil war. I'm sure the British were really excited to hear that Americans were getting ready to go to civil war almost immediately after the American Revolution. So this is indicative of how the Articles of Confederation caused some problems. Now, the problems created by the Articles of Confederation is what these problems are what almost every history teacher in the United States is going to focus on for why a constitution was necessary. But before I talk about how the Constitutional Convention comes around in response to the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, I'd like to talk about one good thing that the Articles of Confederation did, or rather, one good thing that the United States federal government did under the Articles of Confederation. And it was how they responded to this particular problem. Check out this map here. This is a map of the United States of America in the 1780s. One of the very first problems that our young country had to deal with was Western expansionism. Now, when we were British subjects, when we were American colonists, the British had declared that the boundary for the colonies was going to be the Appalachian Mountains. And they did this in the year 1763. This was the Proclamation of 1763. After winning the French and Indian War, the British had reserved the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River for Native Americans. So that was Indian territory. But there was a restlessness and a desire among the American colonists to spread westward. These Americans wanted to go west for land and opportunity. So if you were poor in one of the original 13 colonies, you could cross the Appalachian Mountains. You'd probably have to fight Native Americans, but you could clear land in areas like Kentucky, Ohio, etc. Have your own farm, have your own land, and then potentially have a better life for you and your family. The British said that the American colonists weren't allowed to do this after 1763, but it was very hard to stop the Americans from doing this. But then after the American Revolution, well, all bets are off. We're not British anymore. We're going to do what we please. So if the United States of America owns the land between the Atlantic and the Mississippi, well then here come the Americans to cross the Appalachian Mountains into areas like Tennessee, Kentucky, and our own Ohio. Needless to say, this begins some significant wars between the Americans and the Native Americans. Some of those most vicious wars happen here in Ohio between the Americans and specifically the Shawnee tribe. Famous warriors like Chief Blue Jacket and Chief Tecumseh arose during this time in the late 18th, early 19th century. All right, so how does that relate to the United States federal government under the Articles of Confederation? Well, the big question for them was, and the problem they had to resolve, was whose land is this? We know it belongs to the United States of America, but the United States of America is made up out of states. So to which state does this land belong? Now here's where it's interesting to look at the map. What you see here as you look at particular states on this map, like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, is you see these states attempting to stretch westward, to take the northern and southern boundary of their state and just take those lines and keep drawing them westward, making a claim to whatever is west of it. So these claims were being made, but are those claims legitimate? Do those states have the right to do that? That's not clear. And you can also see how this would create tension and competition between the states. Virginia would have the opportunity to become an absolutely huge empire. Pennsylvania would too. But then you'd have like little Connecticut or Rhode Island. There they are tucked away on the eastern seaboard. And even Connecticut, and I'll focus on Connecticut here for an important reason, Connecticut said, we want land out in the west too. So Connecticut tried to lay a claim to, if you look at this map, the area that is today northern Ohio. So Connecticut essentially wanted what is today Cleveland and Toledo and all of our Lake Erie border. That Connecticut wanted that. The Connecticut said we deserve some of that. Otherwise, Pennsylvania is going to take it all. Okay. So hopefully you see the problem that the United States federal government has to deal with here. So imagine that you were a member of the original United States Congress back in the 1780s, about 1785 when they're really dealing with this. How would you suggest we should solve this problem? Would you just say, okay, states lay claim and allow a competition to ensue? Okay, that's one possible solution. What's probably going to happen there is there's going to be an incredible amount of competition and probably war is going to break out between the states. So that might be problematic. Another possible solution would be, well, put it in the hands of the federal government. Create some sort of impartial committee, a bunch of individuals who could sit down with a map and divide things up evenly and say, hey, Pennsylvania, this is yours. Virginia, this is yours. Georgia, there you go. How about little Rhode Island? You deserve a little land out west too, and there you go. So you could do it like that. But then you'd have states that aren't geographically united. It seems bizarre that Connecticut would be both Connecticut and what's today northern Ohio. That's sort of weird and creates its own little problems. There also might be some problems with the politicking that would go on. How do you choose individuals who are impartial to divide land up? But that was one way to go. Now, the United States federal government in the 1780s did neither of these things. They came up with a new idea, which was to create new states. Now, this seems obvious to us now in the 21st century because we obviously have many more states than the original 13 states. And we know over the course of American history that we've continually added states, especially during the period of westward expansionism. But that was not necessarily clear at the dawn of our country's history in the 1780s. And the piece of legislation passed by the American Congress under the Articles of Confederation government that started a process to help create states was this particular document right here. Written in the middle of the 1780s, but ratified in 1787. It took the approval of all of the original 13 states to pass this law, which makes it amazing. This is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And here's what the Northwest Ordinance is. It might be helpful to look at this map as I talk about the Northwest Ordinance. So first of all, this did not have to do with all of the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, but rather just the lands in the northwest of that territory. That would be all lands north of the Ohio River. So this is kind of neat because this deals very directly with our home state of Ohio. The Northwest Ordinance does two things. One, it establishes a criteria for which new states can be created. But then there's also stipulations for how these states are going to be governed, which is going to create a particular culture in this region of the country, our region of the country. So here's how a region can become a state. Here's how a territory can become a state. First of all, it has to have 60,000 free inhabitants. This would be men, and either individually or their families. You need to have 60,000 free men in this state or in this territory to become a state. So this sort of designates where the boundaries are going to be. Once you have 60,000 individuals there, then they or men there, then they can petition the government for statehood. Okay, so there's that. It's sort of a technical thing. All right, but the rest of them are very interesting because this is the United States federal government saying, okay, if you're going to become a state in this region of the country, you have to adhere to these American values for this region of the country. Most importantly, no slavery in this particular territory. So once again, we're addressing this problematic issue that haunts American history throughout its entirety, the idea of slavery. Now, when we get to the birth of the United States of America, slavery is something that is confined to the southern states. The northern states have abolished slavery. So when in the Northwest Ordinance, slavery is illegal, then this perpetuates the geographical division between the culture of the North, where there is no slavery, and the culture of the South, where there is slavery. Obviously, this is going to culminate into the United States Civil War from 1861 to 1865. But no slavery in the Northwest Territory. All right. Also, if you're going to become a state in this particular area, you must have a Bill of Rights, which also provides for religious freedom. This means that one of these states isn't to have a state religion. Ohio isn't allowed to be exclusively Methodist or something like that. There is to be religious freedom in this area. Each state is supposed to have a legislative assembly that's based upon the population. There are to be trials by jury. In other words, we are to have the elements for a free democracy. This document predates the United States Constitution and influenced it a little bit in this way. And the last element of the Northwest Ordinance that I do personally enjoy talking about, public education was mandated in the ordinance. So in all of the states that are going to come out of the Northwest Ordinance, and there are 6 of them, and you see them here, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, in each of these states, communities were legally bound to provide children with education. So this is education that would be provided through taxpayer dollars. A public education system was to be established in each of these states. So what's this mean? Quite simply, it means that if you're a child growing up in any of these 6 states, you have access to education. Education is not something like a private school that you have to pay to attend, but rather communities which will tax their people who live there will provide a school and an educational system for you. Thomas Jefferson believed that if you're going to have a strong democracy, then the people there must be well educated. And this aspect of the Northwest Ordinance addresses that issue. So we have a public education system that develops in the Northwest Territories. Now, this idea has spread throughout the rest of the United States of America at this point in time in history, but public education wasn't a right everywhere in the United States at this point in time. So as a public educator in Ohio myself, I say this was a wonderful thing. All right, so there's the Northwest Ordinance. Hopefully you can see how in this particular region of the country a unique culture is developing. That makes it different from the culture south of the Ohio River. Okay, so the Northwest Ordinance is one of the crowning achievements of the United States federal government under the Articles of Confederation, and it might have been one of the only great achievements of the United States federal government under the Articles of Confederation, because the Articles of Confederation were oh so weak. States threatening to go to war with other states over economic issues. The United States federal government broke, can't afford to pay soldiers in its army, can't enforce interstate commerce. There's a lot of problems. You even have a major rebellion developing in the state of Massachusetts. So it's decided that the Articles of Confederation need some revision. So, representatives from the 13 states meet once again in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to discuss reforming the Articles of Confederation. 3 days into this top secret meeting, well, I don't know if it's top secret. People knew that they were meeting, but they weren't discussing with the public what was going on in the meeting. Anyway, 3 days into this meeting, one of the representatives from Virginia stood up and said, I say we just scrap the Articles of Confederation and start anew. Let's have a blank slate and create a completely new document. Now, this act was actually illegal. The Articles of Confederation had no provision for just simply getting rid of it, but at this point in time, everybody sort of was having the feeling that the Articles of Confederation don't work. If we're going to survive as a country, we need a completely new document. So, thus it was decided that they were going to create a new constitution for the United States of America. These gentlemen met, having their secret discussion for 116 days. That was nearly 4 months in the summer of 1787. And at the end of it all, the Constitution that they created was slightly incomplete. They weren't able to do a Bill of Rights and put the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And they didn't do this simply out of exhaustion. They were tired after meeting for nearly 4 months. But they did create the structure of the United States federal government, a new structure that would hopefully work far better than the government created by the Articles of Confederation. Great story at the end of this convention. If you take a look at this particular image here, you see the iconic image of George Washington standing in a very dignified posture there to the right. And in the middle of this painting, you see who you recognize as Benjamin Franklin. And a great story at the end of the Constitutional Convention when it was all over and these gentlemen left. Benjamin Franklin was walking down the streets of his hometown of Philadelphia, and somebody approached him and asked Benjamin Franklin, Mr. Franklin, what have you given us, a republic or a king? And Benjamin Franklin responded, we have given you a republic, if you can keep it. What great words. We have given you a republic, if you can keep it. And those are always great words to remember, because democracies are rare in history. It's a lot easier to have a king. It's definitely not as fair, but it's a lot easier just to have a strong monarchy to tell the country what to do. Democracies are precious things. The United States Constitution is an incredibly strong document. It has created a government that has lasted for over 200 years, and hopefully it lasts for many, many more centuries. But in the end, it's still a piece of paper. And what makes the government work is the respect that the people have for that piece of paper and a willingness to abide by the principles of the United States Constitution. Every generation must remember the words of Benjamin Franklin. We've given you a republic, if you can keep it. All right, so it's a long document. It's written in some complicated language. I'm not going to spend any time in this lecture actually reading the Constitution, at least not until we get to the Bill of Rights. I will read some of the Bill of Rights, but for this, I just simply want to talk about the major ideas of the Constitution. And perhaps one of the single biggest ideas of the Constitution is something called the separation of powers. The Constitution divided the United States federal government into three separate branches that had checks and balances against the other. So why did our founding fathers create a constitution that divided the government up? This is an important concept to talk about. And in its essence, it's actually a pretty simple idea. But it goes back to this individual whose image you're seeing right here. He was a Frenchman. He lived in the middle of the 18th century. I don't think he lived to see the American Constitution. He wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws, which was published in the middle of the 18th century, 1748, in French. The English edition came out 2 years later, in the exact middle of the 18th century, 1750. Baron de Montesquieu was a great representative of the Enlightenment. If you remember, during the Enlightenment, you had philosophers who wanted to question everything. They wanted to question authority, they wanted to question tradition, and they questioned authority and they questioned tradition because they were on a quest to create a better society, a more rational, more humane society. That's the spirit of the Enlightenment and the 18th century. So Baron de Montesquieu saw a problem with government. He wanted to create a better form of government. He said that the problem was with a bad government. A problem with a bad government was you had power concentrated into the hands of either one individual, like a king or a queen, or a group, an elite group of individuals, like the British Parliament, for example. So, for example, a king. Now, you could have either a good king who's nice to his people, or you could have a bad king who's mean to his people. But in the 18th century, there was increasingly this idea that kings or monarchs or elite groups of individuals, they were bad. A phrase that was used in the 18th century was that absolute power corrupts absolutely. You put one person in charge or an elite group of people in charge and let them rule unfettered, unencumbered, just let them do what they want, chances are they're going to become cruel and tyrannical in some way, shape, or form. Now, sometimes we wish, well, wouldn't it be great just to have a king who was a good person? Like, if only we could have a king who was a good person, that would solve a lot of problems. It's far more efficient to have one individual who's in charge, who can tell everybody what to do if that person's a good person. But imagine this. Imagine this person was you. Imagine you were given the opportunity to become the king or the queen of the United States of America, and you could do whatever it is that you wanted to do with our country. Now, if you take a moment to just let that settle in, I know if I think about this, I think it'd be a pretty exciting opportunity. You could think of all the amazing things that you could do. You could tell people what to do, what to make, how to behave, here's what the rules are. And you'd create this country that was this great reflection of you and your values. And assuming you have good values, then what an incredible country it could be. But if you're honest with yourself, you might also think, wow, I can do whatever it is I want to do and nobody stops me. Well, you might also think about, well, maybe there was somebody back in elementary school who wasn't too nice to you. Now is your perfect opportunity to get vengeance on that person. And then you find out that all these great sweeping reforms that you made, there's some people who are just a little too stubborn. They don't really like it. And maybe they're starting a group that's coming to kill you so that they can have power. Ooh, and so now you get a little scared. You get a little paranoid. Now, what are you going to do with those group of people? Are you just going to let them, live free? Or maybe you're going to lock them up and torture them? Chances are, if you're like every other human being, you're going to hurt people who you see as a threat. And you're going to become a little bit of a tyrant. In the 18th century, the philosophers were very well aware of this, and they coined this phrase that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so the goal of Baron de Montesquieu was to create the least worst form of government. How do you deal with the fact that human beings tend to be power hungry? Human beings all seem to want to have their own way. Human beings also want security. They want to protect themselves and their family, which means that they probably all want to accumulate wealth and property. And that when individuals who are needed to run a government are placed in positions of power, they tend to become tyrannical. How do you deal with that? How do you create a government that's ruled by human beings of flesh and blood with their own problems? How do you create a government that actually works with faulty human beings running the government? All right, so that was the issue that Montesquieu was dealing with. And Montesquieu concluded, based upon his study of governments in Europe, especially the British government, he concluded that this is how you would set up a government that works. You needed to remove power out of the hands of a single individual or an elite group and divide it up into three separate branches. And no one single branch has all the power. And that one branch of government is sort of, if we can say it like this, in competition with the other two branches of government. Now, if you set the situation up like this, then you're not going to have any individual or a group of individuals become tyrants, hopefully. So this is what Baron de Montesquieu wrote about in his book, The Spirit of the Laws. The founding fathers of at the Constitutional Convention, they read this book, and they used this book as a model for our government. So the model of our government, which has lasted oh so very long, actually came from an aristocratic French philosopher in the middle of the 18th century. So here is what we did when we created the Constitution. We created three branches of government. Our federal government is based upon three separate branches. If you read the Constitution, these are the first three articles of the Constitution. Article 1 creates the legislative branch. This is Congress. The legislative branch is divided up into two houses, the House of Representatives, which is based upon state population, and the Senate. And each state gets 2 senators. You have to be at least 25 years old to be a representative, and you're elected for a 2-year term. You have to be at least 30 years old to be a senator, and you are elected to a 6-year term. Terms are important because if you in some way don't represent your constituency, the people who voted for you very well, then they can vote you out. So you don't have the opportunity to become a tyrant. So that's the legislative branch. The legislative branch has the power to make the laws. This is not the only power that the legislative branch has. It also has the power to declare war. It also has the power to control the money of the country, the treasury. But the big power that the legislative branch has is the power to make laws to rule that are going to rule the country. And then secondly, Article 2 in the Constitution deals with the creation of the executive branch. This would be the President of the United States. The individual needed to run the country. It is very difficult to have a group of a couple hundred individuals run a country. It's a lot more efficient and better if you have one individual. This is going to be the president. So the job of the president is to engage in diplomacy with other countries. The job of the president is to enforce the laws that the legislative branch has created. The legislative branch has the power to declare war against another country, but the President of the United States is also the commander-in-chief. He has the power to run the war. So in the legislative branch and the executive branch, Congress and the President, they have checks and balances to make sure that one or the other doesn't have too much power over the other. Now, what we'll learn throughout American history is that the way the framers of the Constitution originally wrote the Constitution, there was a lot of power given to Congress and less power given to the President of the United States. But over time, the presidency has accumulated more power and Congress has lost power. The major reason for this has been a crisis that's happened in American history, like the United States Civil War in the 1860s or the Great Depression of the 1930s. In those particular situations, the President of the United States took action, and usually these actions were illegal by the Constitution, to accumulate power. And even though in both the Civil War and the Great Depression, the Supreme Court judged the actions of the president as being illegal, the president said, I have to do this in order to save the country. And so over the course of time, the American presidency has accumulated power, and Congress has lost power. We'll learn more about that as we go through American history. But these two branches of government have checks and balances against each other to make sure that neither Congress nor the president becomes tyrannical. So for example, if the legislative branch passes a law that the president doesn't like, the president can veto the law. Simply say, no, this isn't going to become a law. Now, if the legislative branch overwhelmingly likes this law, then they can override the veto, but it takes more of them, 2/3 majority vote, to override the veto. The President of the United States can essentially hire whoever he wants to work for him to create his cabinet, but the Senate has to approve those cabinet members. So the Senate has the power to say, we don't like that individual, we don't think they should be helping you out. So these are a few examples of some of the checks and balances that exist between the legislative branch and the executive branch. But then, of course, we also have a third branch of the United States federal government. This is the judicial branch. This is the Supreme Court. The Constitution did not designate how many Supreme Court justices, how many judges would be in the Supreme Court. However, that number tends to hover around 9. In order to become a member of the Supreme Court, you must be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And once you become a Supreme Court justice, you are a justice for life. And that's kind of unique because you don't get reelected. You can kind of be above the fray of politics. So it doesn't matter if you're conservative or liberal when you become a judge. Once you're a judge, you can begin ruling cases based upon your own rational interpretation of the United States Constitution. And you don't really have to worry about, for the most part, what the American public is going to think of you. You never run for re-election. So you can do what you believe is right based upon your conscience and based upon your interpretation of the United States Constitution. And the judicial branch has the opportunity to interpret the laws. So, for example, if the legislative branch passes a law and the President of the United States signs that law into action, so it actually it goes from being a bill to a law, the judicial branch can go, that's not a constitutional law, or that law is inconsistent with the Constitution, and they can strike it down, and they can make that law null and void. So that seems to be a very special power with the judicial branch. Now, one thing that the judicial branch cannot do is enforce their interpretation. So a great example of this happened in the early 19th century when the President of the United States was forcibly removing Cherokees out of Georgia and essentially stealing their land, forcing the Cherokees to move to Oklahoma on something called the Trail of Tears. The Supreme Court had ruled the President of the United States does not have the power to do this. That land belongs to the Cherokee. And the President of the United States, who at the time was Andrew Jackson, supposedly said, well, let the Supreme Court, he said supposedly, the Supreme Court Justice of the Supreme Court has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Which was essentially the President of the United States of America beating his chest saying, okay, you can make whatever decision you want. It doesn't matter. You have no power to enforce it. Only I have the power to enforce. So essentially you're expecting me just to obey your command, which is how the Constitution is set up. But President Jackson did not. And the Cherokee were illegally forcibly removed from the state of Georgia. So if the president doesn't want to enforce the law, or even if he wants to go against it, who's going to stop him? So this is one example. There are so many incredible examples of the division of government, but hopefully you've got the basic fundamental idea, which is that by dividing up the power in government, and there's no one single individual or an elite group of individuals with all the power, then power is divided. Nobody becomes a tyrant, and therefore the people of the United States are free. A divided government is good for you and me. All right. So I have this fun little image here for how a bill becomes a law, but I think I've already spent enough time with this. Let's go on to this big question about the separation of powers. Does it work? Does it work? If the framers of the United States Constitution back in 1787 could fast forward and visit us in time here in the 21st century, what would they think? Would they say, yeah, what we set up, it works, it works? Or would they be disappointed? Would they see something not working in the division of powers in the United States government? What would they think? Well, first of all, I guess I'm asking an impossible question. How do we know what they think? They're dead. So this is an impossible question to answer. But we can trace how the separation of powers has developed throughout United States history. So first of all, does it work? Well, yes, it does work. There are still three divisions of government. Now, as I've mentioned before, power has shifted a little bit away from Congress and to the presidency. And like I said before, this tends to happen during moments of crisis in American history, usually a war or an economic depression. And these have both been times where the president has said, I have to act in this decisive way. It might be illegal, but I have to do this to save the country. So examples of this. Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln is usually remembered as one of the greatest presidents in American history. But he did some illegal things. He was a tyrant in some ways. So an example of this was there were particular individuals he believed were associated with being Confederate spies, and he just had them locked up in a jail. This is a clear violation of habeas corpus. If you are arrested, you must be told why you're being arrested, and you must have a trial. And he deprived these individuals of this. The Supreme Court of the United States said this act is illegal. Did President Lincoln do anything? No, he just let him stay in jail. And the Supreme Court, they could rant and rave all they want, but they didn't have any power over the presidency to release these people or to force these people to allow them to have a trial. Abraham Lincoln also famously put several border states under martial law. So states like Maryland and Missouri went under martial law, which meant the army was governing the state, not the people's representatives. He did this to force these states, which were slave-owning states, to remain part of the United States of America, to not secede and join the South. And so Abraham Lincoln violated the Constitution, but he would say, I did this to save the United States of America. So in every case, the president says, I had to do this to save the USA. And there were other illegal actions that happened during the Great Depression and World War II. Franklin Roosevelt did some highly questionable things. The Supreme Court called him out on it, and his argument was, I have to save the United States of America. We saw during the 1960s in the Vietnam War a shift of war power, or the power to declare war, being shifted from Congress to the President of the United States, who at the time was Lyndon B. Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson also really felt that he needed to save the United States of America, or protect American interests abroad, at least. And so we have seen throughout American history a shift of power away from Congress and towards the presidency. Okay, so that's happened over time. The one thing that the founding fathers, the individuals at the Constitutional Convention, the one thing they did not really take into consideration, which has had a profound effect on American politics, even if you know very little about American politics, you know this. There are two big political parties today, the Republicans and the Democrats. The concept of political parties was not really factored into the Constitution, and it does sort of play with the balance of power in between the three branches of government. Because most people today think of politics as like a team sport. You're a conservative Republican, or you're a more liberal Democrat, and you've got your team, which represents sort of your values and what you believe the future of America should be, and you're in competition with the other side. So if you're Republican, you don't feel that good about Democrats. If you're a Democrat, you don't feel that good about Republicans. And you both see the others being antagonistic to the future of the United States of America. And this goes back a long way. It goes back to the 1780s even. I mean, these political parties were being founded really early on. So this is how Americans think about politics today. When they think about government, they don't really focus on the three branches of government, although that's obviously a big part of it. But for most of us, politics is Republicans and Democrats. So how does that factor in to the three branches of government? Well, it messes up the balance of power, Because if you are, let's say you're a Republican in Congress, and you have a Republican president, well, then you don't look at the presidency as something that's against your power. You look at the president as a friend. You look at a president as somebody who can help you out. Okay, I'm a Republican. We've got a Republican president. Great, we can pass this legislation. If we've got a conservative Supreme Court, even better. We can do even more. And we'll let the Democrats stew about it. We don't like them and their values anyway. So this does mess with the balance of power, the separation of powers as the framers set up the United States government. So Congress doesn't look at itself as this unified body and they're in conflict with the president. Congress is divided among itself between Republican and Democrats, two primary political parties. And they either look at the president as either a friend or a foe, and they might look at the Supreme Court in the same way. And this is not really reflected in the United States Constitution. Okay, so let's put this into action. Let's talk about the structure of the United States federal government and political parties and how this all works out in terms of how a bill becomes a law. So I thought I'd talk about a law that's relatively recent, that's relatively recent law in American history, the Affordable Care Act, known commonly as Obamacare. Let's talk about how the Affordable Care Act went from a bill to a law, and how the three branches of government interacted with each other, and how Republicans and Democrats interacted with each other in the creation of this law. Okay, so in 2008, Barack Obama was elected president. He is a Democrat. He becomes a Democrat after 8 years of Republican rule under George W. Bush. 2008 was a difficult year in our history. We were suffering from a major economic recession, but the recession doesn't have anything to do with this. Barack Obama had a particular agenda. He really wanted to engage in healthcare reform. Healthcare was, and arguably still is, a major problem in the United States of America today. In 2008, the Obama administration had identified healthcare as a $48 billion problem. Here's what the problem was. You had uninsured individuals, so individuals living in the United States of America without any healthcare insurance. And, sometimes, as happens, people get sick, people get hurt. So let's say there's an uninsured individual who's driving a car, they get into an automobile accident, they are severely hurt, they have to go to a hospital, the doctors have to save the person. There's tens of thousands of dollars of medical procedures that this individual simply cannot pay for. So that means that the hospital has to absorb the cost. This might mean that in the end, the other health insurance companies have to somehow raise their prices for other people to help the hospitals out and paying for all these uninsured people. And there's and the total cost of all of the healthcare given to these uninsured individuals is $48 billion. And this is a problem. So the Obama administration wants to eliminate the problem with the Affordable Care Act. And what the Affordable Care Act would do was this. It would mandate everybody in the United States of America to buy health care. Everybody has to have a healthcare insurance plan. The government would work to create an affordable healthcare plan for all people. If you didn't purchase healthcare, then you were fined. So everybody has healthcare. Once everybody has healthcare, we start to eliminate this $48 billion problem, and hopefully there can be more preventative health programs. We can have hopefully a healthier, stronger United States population, and things would be better in terms of our overall health. So this was one of the primary things on Barack Obama's agenda when he became president of the United States, and he's sworn into office in January of 2009. So here's how it played out. President Obama is the President of the United States of America. He does not have the power to create laws. But because he's a Democrat, he's got Democratic friends that are in Congress. And in fact, Obama previously was a senator. So it's got to be the Democrats in Congress who first introduced the bill into the House of Representatives and then to Senate. And they have to get enough votes to pass it. Now, so here you have the President of the United States of America working cooperatively with other Democrats in Congress. Now, in order to get this law to pass, they've got to work cooperatively with the Republicans. They got to get a few Republicans on their side. So how does this happen? Well, I don't know. I assume that there are some backroom deals that are happening where Democrats say, hey, Republicans, if you support us on this for this legislation, we'll support you on this other legislation that we actually don't like, but you do. So these backroom deals start happening. Now, do these backroom deals get shady, or is there any money exchanged or something illegal like that? Hey, I don't know, but it's politics. I'm sure bad stuff like that happens. But anyways, it's introduced into Congress in July of 2009. About 3/4 of a year later, March 2010, Congress passes it, the House of Representatives and the Senate pass it, and President Barack Obama signs it into law in March of 2010. So it's a law. Essentially, Obamacare is created, which means that Americans have to have insurance. If they do not have health insurance, then they are fined. Because we live in America where there's Republicans versus Democrats, there are conservatives and Republicans who do not like Obamacare and they want to attack it. And they say the President of the United States of America and the United States federal government does not have the right to tell us what we can and cannot buy. If we don't want to purchase health insurance, then we do not have to purchase health insurance. So now's when we start to get into that third branch of government, the judicial branch. If people think that the government has overreached its power, then it can contest the law in the court in the court system. So the United States government was challenged in the courts. This court case worked its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had to rule on the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. Is Obamacare legal? Does the United States government have the right and the power to say to you as an American, you must purchase health care? And this was argued, it was discussed, it was debated, and in the end, the Supreme Court decided that yes, the Affordable Care Act is legal. And this was decided in June of 2012. Supreme Court Justice John Roberts issued a statement explaining their interpretation of the Constitution as it applies to the Affordable Care Act. And he said this, now this is me paraphrasing it, he said that the United States Constitution grants the federal government the power to tax citizens. If the federal government can say you must pay taxes, you must render up this money for the benefit of the entire country through taxes, then the United States federal government can tell you that you have to pay the individual mandate or you have to abide by the individual mandate to purchase health care. This is not a violation of your freedom. The Constitution does grant the federal government the power to do this. So there you go. Now, does that mean it's over? No, of course not. The partisan warfare between Democrats and Republicans continues in terms of, well, how do we solve the healthcare crisis in this country, and how do we do it in a way that's consistent with the values of either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? So when Donald Trump was elected president in the year 2016, he's a Republican, and his administration has been working on creating a different healthcare system that would in part dismantle the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. And as of the recording of this lecture, it is very uncertain what the future of the Affordable Care Act is, or what, if anything, will come along to replace it. But there you go. There's a brief overview of the separation of powers in the United States Constitution, why and how the framers set it up, and how it is played out in American history. All right, that's my first lecture on the United States Constitution. I'll see you later for this second. Have a great day, United States history students. Bye-bye.